I want to share just a little bit about my experience with using Lectio Divina, the tradition Lectio Divina, in the classroom with students, particularly gathered around the reading of poetry. One of the things that I've noticed that's problematic in almost all classroom experiences with poetry is this very flat reading. What we tend to do, we tend to approach poetry from what Louise Rosenblatt would call an efferent stance. Quite often our goal is to extract meaning, but extract it for certain purposes, to make arguments. It's as though the poem were some sort of a grand puzzle to be solved, and there's almost a feel in some classrooms like there's some big prize for solving the puzzle, and it can become even very competitive as we vie in classroom discussions about certain interpretations and when we defend our stance, our view. All of that's fine and good. I've done poetry explication and all of that. But it only gives us a certain type of engagement with a poem. And I don't think, being a poet myself, it's particularly the type of engagement that any poet desires a reader to have with his or her poem. So our problem is we get at a very narrow band of knowing, ways of knowing traditionally in our classrooms, and students come away from our classrooms having grappled with some poems, or perhaps I should say some texts, but never having experienced a poem. And that's really problematic. That's where Lectio Divina comes in. Lectio was developed in the tradition, in the Christian mystical tradition, developed by people interested not so much in working on the text. Of course, the text was sacred scripture. They weren't so interested in working on the text as much as they were interested in allowing the text to work on them. That's a very different thing. Allowing the text to work on me has less to do with dissection, going to the text, pulling it apart, and has a lot more to do with opening up to the text. Well, opening up to the text requires a number of things that we typically don't provide much of in a classroom, particularly silence and space. We're on a tight schedule. We maximize efficiency. We move through our activities, boom, 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 and of course we're pushed toward that. That's not the way of Lectio Divina. That's not the way to allow a text to work on me. So, the stages in Lectio, as I have adapted it for use, I want to talk briefly about those and what those look like in this particular activity that I like to use. The first stage is Lectio, which is simply the reading of the poem. And the way I like to do this is have at least 2 or 3 full readings of the poem. We gather in a circle, and I've asked generally about 3 individuals to read the poem, to give voice to the poem into the circle. We begin with silence. We hear the first voicing of the poem. There's generous silence. We hear the second voicing. Generous silence. We hear the third voicing. And none of this is timed. It's all very much in the context of that moment, of what the individuals are sensing and feeling. Certainly not a rush to accomplish the next step. That's not Lectio. So after we've listened to the voicings as a group, we remain in silence until we move into the next stage, which is meditatio. Now, traditionally, in reading a sacred text, this is where the reader would really allow the text to work within the soul, looking for phrases, words, important ideas that would lift up from the text and become more important. And to just hold those phrases, turn those phrases over, look at them from behind, however you want to say it, but to allow those words and phrases that rise in significance to work on the reader. In our circle, because we're doing this communally, we give voice to those words and phrases that rise. One of the important things is that no one voices any language other than language rising up out of the poem. So we don't have anything that starts out with, well, you know that line that talked about, well, that was really interesting. You know, this part reminded me of, and none of that happens. The only thing that's voiced into the circle are the phrases rising out of the poem. This takes as long as it takes, and it takes many interesting directions. Sometimes it's very quiet. Sometimes it grows in intensity. But one of the things that I have become interested in recently, because I'm also a musician, is the idea that the musicality of the language holds great significance, communicates remarkably well to us in ways that are below the surface quite often and that we're not aware of. And so I encourage those who are participating in Lectio Divina to play with those musical elements: tone, volume, rate, and pitch. All of those things that we do intuitively in our language, those things that give us away. Even if my words say one thing, the musicality of my phrasing may say something else. We play with those things. We don't change the words, but we interact with the musicality. To listen to some of the same phrases that are rising up into significance to me and hear them vocalized in different ways and hear the music makes this a communal, interactive thing. There is more happening than simply if I were interacting with the poem on my own, even using Lectio Divina on my own. So we spend a period of time vocalizing, and as that begins to recede, and generally there's one person who is staying aware of that, then I will generally ring a bell or something, and we'll move into the next stage, which is oratio. Traditionally, that's a stage of prayer, a stage in which I voice my own words in response to my interaction with the text. I voice my words to God. I voice my words, and it can take any form, but always prayerful. In this context, we turn to journaling. I encourage all the participants to have journals in hand, and we still approach it in a very prayerful way. But participants record sometimes some of the phrases that came up in significance. Sometimes participants compose their own poem. Sometimes participants write a little bit about the experience, what part of them it touched, what parts seem to rise up in significance, what parts of the vocalization seem to rise up in significance. That's a very open time. At the end of that, then, we'll make an invitation to share some of those prayerful journal entries, and that brings us to the final stage, which is not an end at all, and it's contemplatio. The contemplatives, their goal was not to practice an intense experience that ended. The goal was to imbue all of life with that same openness. So contemplatio is an awareness of taking this experience, what's gained from this experience, taking it away and going into my walk, onto the path, out into the world, carrying that with me, being fundamentally changed by the experience. My interaction with the text, allowing the text to work on me, has changed me in some fundamental way. A marvelous thing, a marvelous goal for poetry. In fact, as we approach poetry in this way, we acknowledge the sacred nature of poetry. It's not utilitarian. It's asking something more of us. It's asking us to be changed. It's also asking us to enter into that space and experience the words and the space between the words, not simply to analyze, dissect, argue. And in this way, it promotes those things that we value most: wisdom and love. Instead of the dualistic thinking, creating an argument, either or, black and white, we move more into that both and thinking, where I gain an understanding by giving myself to a text and to the voicings of the individuals who are participating as well. I think that's a pretty good thing for us to allow poetry to do.